Finally, that brings us to the red line, which is the A2 scenario, which a friend of mine once referred to as the suicide line. This is the expected trajectory of climate change if humans undertook no curtailment of greenhouse gas emissions whatsoever. Economic growth continues as it has in the past and powers itself entirely with fossil fuels, whether it be coal or natural gas or oil. There is no reduction in those burning, no attempt to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases whatsoever, and you can see that the ever-increasing curved characteristic, that curved trajectory to global climate change, persists under the models, accelerating faster and faster, coming close to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century and continuing to rise without stopping for breath. This is a severe climate change scenario, a rather frightening future, but the climate scientists who put together the IPCC report in 2007 felt that this was unlikely, that surely the world community would not be crazy enough to continue to burn fossil fuels as quickly as we could get them out of the ground, right? So what does this look like across the entire Earth? There's a spatial as well as a temporal component to this. We want to see which portions of the world are most affected. So what you see here are three different models, the models that I mentioned before. The optimistic model at the top, the most likely model in the middle, and the suicide model at the bottom. And on the left side, we see the global mean temperature anomalies for the decade between 2020 and 2029. And these are increases in mean temperature above the 2000 average. And on the right, looking a little farther ahead, the last decade of the 21st century from 2090 to 2099. The important takeaway point from this is that the climate models are expecting roughly equivalent increases in mean temperature under all three scenarios in the first part of the 21st century. There's not a great deal of difference between any of those maps on the left-hand side there. But on the right-hand side, we see a dramatic difference. Warming in all of these models is throughout the northern hemisphere, particularly severe at the pole, but increasing drastically in severity as we go down towards the least optimistic model down at the bottom there. You can see even under the optimistic model, this is the Kyoto Protocol sort of model, by the end of the century, we see dramatic increases of temperature close to 5 degrees Celsius throughout the polar regions and across much of northern Canada and northern Russia. Keep in mind that a 5 degrees Celsius increase is equivalent to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in annual mean temperature. This is a tremendous increase in temperature. Under this scenario, there is no ice cap at the North Pole. And this is the most optimistic scenario that we are currently having as far as climate change goes. All the way down to the most severe model, where we have increases of close to 8 degrees Celsius across almost the entire northern polar region, and extending down 5 or 6 degrees throughout most of Asia and North America. So these are truly tremendous increases in global mean temperature across most of the more populated regions of the northern hemisphere. This is going to have serious impacts on the habitability of these regions and on agriculture in some of the most developed nations in the world. But there's another aspect of climate that we haven't talked about much yet, and that's precipitation. What impact is climate change going to have on precipitation patterns? Well, again, to show the ability of these models to make predictions about precipitation patterns as well as temperature patterns across the world, we see here on the top the current precipitation patterns across the world in the northern hemisphere winter and the northern hemisphere summer, with bluer areas being wetter and redder areas being drier. And we can see the seasonal dynamics, rainy seasons and so forth across much of the world here. And in the middle, we have the model's projections for the present day, given information from earlier in the past about what precipitation patterns would look like. And again, the point of these two figures, the two on the top and the two in the middle, is to show that the model is able to accurately predict present-day precipitation patterns given past information. This is, again, a fitting technique used to determine if the model can make reasonable projections into the future. If we can predict the present using information from the past, we should be able to predict the future using information from the present. So the bottom two figures there, again, during Northern Hemisphere winter and summer, show the increase or decrease in average temperature during that season at each point on the Earth at the end of the 21st century. And what we see there is that there is a substantial increase in precipitation across much of the Northern Hemisphere during the Northern Hemisphere winter. Winters are expected to get a lot wetter. But there are some exceptions to this. We see that northern Africa gets substantially drier during the winter, as does large portions of Mexico. And we also see during the northern hemisphere summer that Europe gets substantially drier, as does India and northern China. So these are all areas that depend on their particular seasonal precipitation patterns to drive the dominant form of agriculture in that region. So we can see a vast increase in precipitation in China during the winter. Will play hell with the wheat crops that a great deal of northern China depends on for feeding their population, whereas the loss of the monsoonal rainy season in India will do great damage to rice cultivation in that region, which is another staple crop. The Mediterranean will have very low rain during the summer, which will have a big impact on the crops that are important there, and I could go on. We're talking about massive shifts in seasonal precipitation patterns in some of the most populated portions of the world, including into portions of the world that do not suffer as serious a temperature change as portions of the northern hemisphere. So global climate change truly is a global phenomenon.